where success is everything, one man decides to risk it all to discover the truth about his fiancée's love. What happens when a millionaire, on the brink of losing everything, tests the loyalty of the woman he's about to marry? Betrayal, heartbreak, and shocking twists await in this emotional journey. Will he find real love, or will everything he's worked for slip through his fingers? Stay tuned to find out. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Samuel Brooks stood in front of his sleek glass office window, watching the city of Chicago breathe beneath him. The skyline stretched endlessly, glittering with the promise of wealth and success. He had built this empire, his empire, a real estate mogul, a name that people respected, even feared in the world of business. But as he stood there, staring out at the sprawling city below, Samuel felt an emptiness settle deep within him. The weight of the silence in the office, the constant hum of city life just out of reach, was deafening. He glanced at the framed photos on the wall, images of his lavish penthouse, his sleek office, and his life with Charlotte. Everything seemed perfect, but none of it felt real. The ringing of his phone broke his trance. He sighed and reached for it, already knowing what the call was about. His business partner, Maggie Taylor, had been in the trenches with him from the beginning, and it was never good news when she called unexpectedly. "Sam, we need to talk." Maggie's voice was sharp, her tone urgent. "The investors are pulling out. We're not going to make it through this unless we make some serious changes, and fast." Samuel's stomach sank. The panic that had been simmering beneath his calm exterior for the last few weeks was now spilling over. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. "How bad is it, Maggie?" "The real estate market has bottomed out. We've got properties that aren't moving and bills stacking up. I hate to say it, but unless we restructure everything, we'll be bankrupt by the end of the month. I'm trying to get some of the team on board, but you need to make the call, Sam. You need to decide what we're doing." Samuel could hear the worry in her voice, even through the phone. For the first time in years, he felt his world, his carefully constructed empire, beginning to crumble. He had always prided himself on making the right calls, being the one to stay ahead of the curve. But now it seemed the curve had caught up to him, and it was unforgiving. "Okay," he muttered, his mind racing with plans he wasn't sure would work. "I'll take care of it. We'll figure this out." But deep down, Samuel knew this wasn't just about the company anymore. This wasn't about making deals or closing transactions. Something had changed in him, something more profound. The emptiness in his heart had spread into his work, into his relationship with Charlotte, and now even his very identity felt uncertain. As he ended the call, Samuel stared at his reflection in the glass. Who was he really? Was he the man who had built all this, or was he just the man who was losing it all? A sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Charlotte, standing in the doorway with her usual cool elegance, dressed in a sharp designer outfit that screamed perfection. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Happy birthday, darling," she said, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. "I just wanted to remind you that we're still on for dinner tonight, right? The gala at the museum? I'll need you to be the face of the evening." Samuel forced a smile, trying to mask the anxiety gnawing at his insides. "Yeah, of course. We're still on," he said, his words falling flat as they left his mouth. Charlotte's smile widened, though it felt more like a business transaction than affection. "Good. I'll let you get back to work," she said, turning on her heel and exiting the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Samuel watched her go, his heart heavy. He had everything: wealth, status, a beautiful fiancée. Yet somehow, it all felt hollow. Their relationship had become more about appearances than connection. Charlotte was the perfect arm candy, the socialite who helped him maintain his image. But when he needed her most, when his world was collapsing, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really there for him at all. He turned back to his desk and glanced at the pile of papers waiting for his attention. But the weight of it all, the business, the lies, the superficiality, pressed down on him. Was this really what he wanted? As the city continued to buzz below him, Samuel's thoughts drifted to Maggie's words. If the business failed, everything he had worked for would vanish. And Charlotte? Would she stay by his side? Or would she simply walk away when the money was gone? He didn't have the answers yet, but deep down, Samuel knew that the answers wouldn't come from a boardroom or a business deal. They would come from within himself, from confronting the truths he had been avoiding. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and half-hearted attempts at staying calm. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the skyline, Samuel felt more lost than ever. He had built his life on the idea of success, but now he was starting to wonder, what if the success he had worked so hard to achieve wasn't what he really wanted after all? The evening was drawing in, and Chicago's skyline glittered with the energy of a city that never slept. Samuel leaned back in his office chair, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. The phone call from Maggie still echoed in his mind. The impending collapse of Brooks & Company had become impossible to ignore, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd worked for was about to slip through his fingers. It wasn't just the business, it was his entire life. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like everything he'd built, every relationship, had been founded on a lie. He looked out at the view once more, but this time it didn't bring him any peace. The bright lights below were a reminder of everything he had to lose, and how little he actually had left. His thoughts turned to Charlotte. Their engagement had started as a fairy tale, a union that appeared perfect to the outside world, but it was far from that. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more Samuel realized how little he actually knew her. Was she really with him for love? Or was she just another part of his carefully crafted world, there to help maintain the illusion of success? That question gnawed at him, and then a thought hit him, an idea as bold and reckless as it was necessary. The next morning, Samuel sat across from Maggie in her cluttered office. Papers were scattered across the desk, and her computer screen flashed with financial reports. She looked up from her work when he entered, her brow furrowing as she noticed the determined look on his face. "Sam, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost," Maggie said, pushing aside the pile of paperwork. Samuel sat down, his hands steepled in front of him, eyes fixed on the desk as if contemplating something monumental. "I've been thinking about everything, and I think I know what I need to do," he said, his voice low. Maggie raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "What are you talking about?" "I need to know if Charlotte truly loves me, or if she's just here for the lifestyle," Samuel said, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm going to stage the bankruptcy. I want to see how she reacts when the money's gone." There was a long silence between them. Maggie stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Sam, that's dangerous," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just about your business. It's your life, your future with her. You're playing with fire." "I don't see any other option," Samuel replied, his voice hardening. "I need the truth, Maggie. I need to know if she's really here for me, or if I'm just another project to her. If she stays with me when everything crumbles, then maybe there's something real between us. But if she walks away, then I'll know the answer. I'll know I've been living a lie." Maggie leaned back in her chair, shaking her head, though there was a trace of concern in her eyes. "I get it, Sam. You want to know the truth, but there's no going back once you do this. You'll burn a bridge, and there's no guarantee she'll stay." "I know, but I need to know," Samuel said firmly. "You've always been the one to keep me grounded. Help me with this. Let's make sure everything looks like it's falling apart. I'll handle the rest." Maggie sighed, clearly torn. After a moment of silence, she nodded. "Okay, but you have to promise me you'll handle this carefully. If it backfires, you're going to lose more than just your company." Samuel didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing, laying out the pieces of his plan. This was a dangerous game he was about to play, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of clarity. The world around him, his business, his relationship, had been nothing but a performance. He was going to find out if it was all worth it, or if he had been living in a lie all along. Back in his penthouse later that evening, Samuel sat alone in the dim light. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but it felt necessary. The future of his company could be on the line, but there was more at stake here than just business. There was his heart, his trust, and a relationship that had become a transaction more than a partnership. The phone buzzed on the table, and Samuel glanced at it. It was Charlotte, of course. She was reminding him about their dinner plans, about the event they were attending later that week. Her message was polite, detached, and sterile. "Don't forget about dinner tomorrow. I'll meet you at 7. Samuel stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the reply button. Part of him wanted to ignore her entirely, to tell her that he needed space, that things weren't going well. But that wouldn't give him the truth he needed. He needed her to react, to show her true colors when everything wasn't perfect. With a deep breath, he typed back, "Of course, I'll see you then." He set the phone down, feeling a cold sense of inevitability. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the test. Would Charlotte stay by his side, or would she walk away the moment things got tough? As he looked out at the Chicago skyline once more, Samuel's heart raced. The city that had given him everything now felt like a cage. A beautiful, glittering cage. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning after his conversation with Maggie, Samuel sat at his desk, his hands resting nervously on the cold surface of the mahogany table. The weight of the decision he had made the night before seemed heavier now, his mind spinning with doubt and uncertainty. The plan was set, but the fear of what might come next lingered in his thoughts. Could he really go through with this? Could he handle the truth once it was revealed? Samuel's phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was Charlotte, of course, reminding him of their dinner plans. He had barely acknowledged her presence in their texts, but now, as he looked at her name flashing on the screen, the reality of his situation hit him again. He tapped the message open, his fingers hesitant as he read. "Are we still on for tonight? I'm excited to finally see you. The gala should be amazing." He could almost hear the excitement in her voice through the text, but Samuel felt nothing but a tightening in his chest. It was the same tone she had used for the past few months, polite, detached, like a business transaction. His mind raced back to the night before, to the conversation with Maggie. Samuel had agreed to go through with the plan to fake bankruptcy, but something inside him stirred now. Was this really the right thing to do? What if Charlotte was genuinely concerned, but didn't know how to express it? He had to know, but as the day wore on, his doubt only grew. That evening he arrived at the restaurant, the familiar setting of luxury and elegance. Charlotte was already there, seated at a candle-lit table in the corner, her back straight and posture perfect. She looked the part of the perfect fiancée, polished, confident, beautiful. But Samuel felt distant from her. Was this really the person he had once imagined building his life with? He approached the table, offering a tight smile. Charlotte looked up, her lips curling into a smile of her own, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stood, her designer dress rustling as she hugged him briefly. "You look great," she said, her voice smooth. "Everything's going to be fine, right?" Samuel nodded, though the words felt hollow. "I hope so." They both sat down, the flickering candle between them casting soft shadows across the table. For a moment there was silence, the kind that hung in the air, thick with unspoken thoughts. Charlotte picked up her wineglass, swirling the red liquid thoughtfully before taking a sip. She was still the picture of elegance, but Samuel noticed the slight edge in her gaze, a tension he hadn't seen before. "So," she began, her tone light but calculating, "have you made any headway with the company? I'm sure it's all just temporary setbacks, right? I mean, you've always come out on top before." Samuel's pulse quickened. Temporary setbacks. He almost laughed at how perfectly those words fit into the narrative she had created for him. She had no idea what was really happening, or maybe she didn't care enough to ask. He forced himself to take a slow breath, trying to push down the anger that was rising within him. This was it. This was the moment. "Actually," he said, his voice measured, "I need to talk to you about something. The company. It's not just a setback. It's more serious than that. We're on the verge of bankruptcy, Charlotte. Things are about to get really difficult, and I don't know if I can turn it around." Charlotte's expression didn't change immediately. She set her glass down slowly, her fingers curling around the stem as she studied him. Samuel braced himself for her reaction, wondering if this was where everything would come crumbling down. "I see," she finally said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Well, you've always been good at handling things like this. I'm sure it's just a bump in the road. I mean, everything has a solution, right?" Samuel blinked, trying to hide his disbelief. Was this really how she felt? He had just told her that everything he had worked for was falling apart, and her first concern was whether he could fix it. Her lack of genuine worry was staggering. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "Charlotte, I need you to understand that this is not just about fixing things. It's about what happens when it all falls apart. What happens when everything I've built is gone?" She raised an eyebrow, her face smooth but with a touch of tension around her mouth. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," she said again, her words light but distant. "But if you don't, well, we'll have to figure out what's next, right? Life moves on, Samuel." It felt like a slap in the face. Samuel's chest tightened and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. The truth was right in front of him, staring him down. Charlotte wasn't here for him. She was here for the lifestyle, for the comfort that came with his success. And now, when everything was falling apart, she had already started to distance herself. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stared at her, watching her fidget with her wine glass, avoiding his gaze. "Is this what it's really about, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't even acknowledge that I'm in pain right now. You can't even pretend to care about what I'm going through. This isn't love, this is business." Charlotte froze, the words sinking in. For the first time, she looked directly at him, her eyes hard. "Don't be dramatic, Samuel. You knew what you were getting into when you got into this. You knew what kind of life we had. You knew this was about more than just us." Samuel's heart sank. There it was. The truth. The cold, brutal reality. She was right about one thing he had known, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. His world, his life had been a lie. Everything he had thought was love, was real, was nothing more than a carefully constructed image. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I think it's time we stopped pretending," he said, his voice sharp and final. This isn't real." Charlotte's gaze flickered briefly with something like frustration, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Fine. If you need some space, Samuel, I understand. But you know where to find me when you figure it out." As Samuel walked out of the restaurant, his chest tight with the weight of the confrontation, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The woman he had once thought he could build a future with wasn't just leaving him. She had never been there to begin with. And now, as he stepped into the cold Chicago night, Samuel felt the full weight of his decision. He had crossed the line. There was no going back now. Everything was unraveling, and the only question left was how deep the destruction would go. The wind cut through Chicago's streets as Samuel walked aimlessly, the city's skyline towering above him but offering no comfort. His heart felt heavy, his chest tight from the confrontation with Charlotte. As the night grew colder, he realized he had nowhere to go. He couldn't go back to his penthouse, not yet, not after what had happened. His mind replayed the words Charlotte had said, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You knew what you were getting into, Samuel. It wasn't love. It had never been love. It had been a performance, a carefully constructed illusion to maintain their social standing. And now that the performance was over, she was already calculating her next move." Samuel's feet carried him without a destination, his mind consumed by the weight of everything that had just unfolded. He walked through the streets of Lincoln Park, past upscale restaurants and cozy cafes, the familiar landscape now feeling strangely foreign. That's when he saw it. A small, unassuming cafe tucked in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. The warm glow spilling from the windows and the soft hum of conversation inside drew him in. Without thinking, he pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth immediately surrounding him. The cafe was modest, but there was something about it that felt different, authentic, cozy, real. Samuel took a deep breath, his nerves easing for the first time that evening. He hadn't realized how much he had been craving something genuine, something simple. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the barista behind the counter looked up. Her name was Lena Evans, and she smiled as she wiped her hands on a towel. She had short curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and there was a softness in her eyes that immediately put Samuel at ease. "Welcome," she said with a friendly tone. "What can I get you?" Samuel hesitated for a moment, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "Just a coffee," he replied, his voice rough. "Black." Lena nodded and began to prepare the coffee. As she worked, Samuel watched her, noticing the ease with which she moved. There was no rush in her actions, no tension in her posture. She was present in the moment, and for a brief second, Samuel wished he could be the same. "Rough day?" Lena asked as she handed him his coffee, her tone gentle yet perceptive. Samuel didn't want to talk, but something in her voice made it impossible to lie. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, and then let out a sigh. "Yeah, you could say that." Lena paused for a moment, leaning against the counter, her expression soft. "Want to talk about it?" Samuel hesitated. He didn't know her, and yet there was something about her, something unguarded and real, that made him feel like he could. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, looking down into his cup. "Start anywhere," Lena said simply, a quiet reassurance in her voice. Something in her tone made Samuel feel like he could breathe again, like he wasn't carrying the world on his shoulders. He took another sip of coffee, the warmth soothing him as he spoke. "I don't know. Everything's falling apart. My company, my life. It's all unraveling, and I don't know what to do anymore." Lena listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. There was no judgment in her gaze, just a quiet understanding, a kind of empathy that Samuel had long since stopped expecting from anyone. "Sometimes when everything falls apart," she said softly, "it's because something better is trying to come together." Samuel looked up, surprised by her words. "You really believe that?" She nodded, offering him a small smile. "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point?" Her words were simple, but they hit Samuel in a way he wasn't prepared for. He had been so consumed by his fear of losing everything, by the need to protect what he had built, that he had forgotten to ask himself what really mattered. As Lena continued to prepare other drinks for the customers who came and went, Samuel found himself lingering, not just because of the coffee, but because of the strange comfort he felt in her presence. She didn't want anything from him. She didn't need him to be anything other than himself. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one he hadn't felt in a long time. "Do you come here often?" Lena asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Samuel thought for a moment. "First time, I just needed to get out of my head for a bit." Lena smiled. "Well, you're welcome anytime. Coffee's always better when you don't have to think about it." He chuckled softly, and for the first time that day it felt genuine. He was used to laughter that felt hollow, forced, part of the social dance. But this felt like real laughter, the kind that came from somewhere deep inside. "I'll keep that in mind," Samuel said, looking at her with newfound appreciation. Lena finished up with her last customer and walked over to him as the cafe began to quiet down. She leaned casually against the counter, her eyes meeting his with quiet curiosity. "So what's your story? What's got you running around Chicago looking like you just walked out of a storm?" Samuel paused, taking in her easygoing nature. It felt like for the first time in weeks, someone was actually asking about him. Not about the business, not about his success. Just him. He didn't feel the need to explain everything right away. Instead, he simply said, "I'm just figuring things out. I thought I had it all figured out, but now, I'm not so sure." Lena nodded thoughtfully, her gaze never leaving his. "Well, you're not alone in that. Life's funny that way. It'll knock you down when you least expect it." He looked at her, her eyes filled with empathy, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe he had been too focused on the wrong things, on the appearance of success, on building an empire that felt more like a trap than a dream. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted quietly, looking down at his coffee cup. "But maybe that's okay." Lena smiled, a soft, reassuring expression. "Maybe it is," she said, the simple truth of her words lingering in the air between them. For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt like he could breathe. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. Not right now. He stood, placing his coffee cup down on the counter. "Thanks, Lena, I needed this." She gave him a small wave. "Anytime, Samuel, don't be a stranger." As he stepped back into the night, Samuel felt something shift within him, a small but significant change. He wasn't sure where his path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. And maybe that was all he needed. The day after his chance encounter with Lena, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was a strange weightlessness in the air, an unspoken promise that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to have it all figured out right now. But as comforting as the thought was, it didn't change the fact that his life was still unraveling. His company was on the verge of collapse, and no amount of pleasant conversations in a cozy cafe could erase that reality. Samuel sat at his desk, the glow from his laptop screen illuminating the documents that seemed to mock him. Financial reports, spreadsheets, and emails from irate investors filled his inbox, each one a reminder that he was running out of time. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed louder, like a constant countdown to the inevitable. He'd spent the night thinking about it, about everything. He had cut ties with Charlotte, his world crumbling around him. Yet there was one person left he hadn't spoken to about this. Someone who might understand, even if only a little. Arthur Brooks, his father, a man who had built his own empire in the same industry, a man who had never offered affection, but had always held the power of advice in his steady, commanding voice. Samuel's relationship with his father had always been complicated, based more on duty than love. Arthur's world was one of ambition and ruthless pragmatism, and Samuel had spent years trying to live up to his father's expectations. As much as Samuel hated to admit it, he needed him now. The company was on the brink, and despite his pride, Samuel had nowhere else to turn. He dialed the number, the ringing tone stretching out far longer than it should have. Finally, his father's voice came through the line, low and firm as always. "Samuel," Arthur said, his tone giving away nothing of what he might be feeling. "What is it?" "I need your help," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've made a mess of things. The company, it's about to go under." There was a long pause on the other end. Samuel could hear the rustling of papers, the faint clinking of ice in a glass, Arthur's signature background noise during phone calls. Samuel's heart raced, but he braced himself for what was coming next. "You always were too focused on the wrong things," Arthur finally replied, his voice not unkind but flat. "You've never had the stomach for risk, Samuel. That's your problem." Samuel clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I was trying to play it safe, but I didn't see the signs. The market crashed and we're drowning in bad investments. I can't fix this alone." Arthur didn't respond right away. The silence stretched on, and Samuel could feel his father's judgment from miles away. It wasn't like Arthur to offer unsolicited advice, and Samuel knew that asking for help was more than just an admission of failure. It was a desperate plea. "I don't know what you expect me to say, son," Arthur said finally, his voice carrying the weight of years of disappointment. "You've always wanted to prove yourself, but I never saw you take the big risks. Maybe if you had, you wouldn't be in this situation." Samuel's stomach tightened. He had spent so many years trying to earn his father's respect, but it seemed as though nothing he did would ever be enough. His father wasn't just disappointed in the situation. It was as if he had been waiting for Samuel to fail. "I know you're angry," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't have time for lectures right now. I need your help. We need to figure out how to survive this." Arthur let out a long sigh, the kind that signaled resignation more than frustration. "Fine," he said finally, "but you'll have to do the heavy lifting. I'll make a few calls, but don't expect me to carry you." Samuel felt a mix of relief and bitterness. He had expected no more than this. His father's form of help was always just a step removed from indifference, but it was better than nothing, at least for the moment. "Thank you," Samuel said, though the words felt hollow. "I'll do whatever it takes to turn this around." Arthur's voice softened, just slightly. "We'll see. But don't expect miracles. You've already burned a lot of bridges. The line clicked dead before Samuel could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, a strange mixture of anger and acceptance washing over him. His father had done what he always did, dropped his burden on Samuel's shoulders and stepped back. But Samuel had no choice now. He had to follow through. As he sat in the empty office, staring at the papers that still seemed to overwhelm him, a part of him wondered what would have happened if he had reached out for help earlier. Would things have been different? Or had his pride simply kept him from admitting the truth to himself and others? The faint sound of the elevator chimed outside his office door, signaling someone's arrival. He wasn't in the mood for another distraction, but when the door opened, it wasn't who he expected. It was Maggie standing in the doorway with a worried look on her face. She had been the one person in the company who had stayed by his side through thick and thin, the one person who had never sugarcoated things for him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. Samuel looked up, meeting her gaze. For the first time in a while, he let his guard down. "No, but I don't have much of a choice anymore, Maggie. The company is crumbling and my father is, well, being my father. I don't know what else to do." Maggie walked over and sat down in the chair across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know. I'm here, Sam. We'll figure this out together." His chest tightened as he realized just how much he needed her, not just as an employee, but as a person who truly cared. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone. Samuel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Maggie." For the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days following Samuel's conversation with his father were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and long hours spent in front of spreadsheets that only seemed to mock him. Every attempt to calm the storm felt like a futile effort, and the pressure was suffocating. As much as he wanted to push through, the weight of his company's financial collapse and the looming uncertainty about his future weighed heavily on him. Charlotte hadn't reached out since their conversation at the restaurant. Samuel wondered if she was busy managing her own affairs, or if she had already moved on as he suspected. Either way, he knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The emotional toll of the bankruptcy was far worse than the financial one. Then came the unexpected phone call. It wasn't Charlotte. It wasn't his father either. It was Victor Reed. Victor was the type of person who never let an opportunity slip through his fingers. A competitor in the real estate industry, Victor had always kept a close eye on Samuel's business, even as they'd both climbed to the top. Samuel had never trusted Victor, too smooth, too calculating, but right now, he couldn't afford to turn anyone away. At least, that's what he told himself. "Samuel," Victor's voice was smooth as always, almost too calm. "I've been hearing some unsettling news about Brooks and Company. I thought we should have a little chat." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard enough of Victor's games to know that this was not a friendly conversation. Still, he couldn't afford to ignore him. "I'm not in the mood for games, Victor. What do you want?" Samuel's voice came out sharper than he intended, but the exhaustion was starting to show. He needed something, anything, to help steady the ship. Victor chuckled, the sound almost too pleasant. "Games? I think you'll find that this is more of an opportunity than a game. Look, Samuel, I've always respected your drive, but let's face it, you're going to need help. I can offer that. You know I've got connections in the right places, and together, we can make sure this little financial hiccup doesn't ruin you completely." Samuel frowned, his mind already on high alert. This was the moment he had been dreading. Victor wasn't offering help. He was offering leverage. Samuel could feel the trap closing in. "I'm listening," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice even. "Good. Let's meet. I think we can come to a mutual understanding. I know how to make sure your company survives this, and I think you know the kind of help I can provide." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He knew exactly what kind of help Victor was referring to, help that would come at a cost. But right now he had few options. His reputation was on the line. Brooks and Company was on the verge of collapse, and Charlotte's indifference had only deepened his sense of isolation. Perhaps Victor's help was a necessary evil, but something inside him recoiled at the thought. Later that afternoon, Samuel found himself in the familiar cold atmosphere of a high-end restaurant downtown, a place where the elite went to make deals and whisper behind closed doors. As he entered, he saw Victor already seated at a corner booth, his face illuminated by the soft lighting, a glass of whiskey in hand. The man had always exuded confidence, but today there was something more about him, a predatory calm that set Samuel's nerves on edge. Victor's smile was a mixture of condescension and curiosity. "Samuel, glad you could make it. I'm sure this is a lot to take in." Samuel took a seat across from him, his mind working overtime as he scanned the menu, though he wasn't really interested in food. "I'm not sure what you're offering here, Victor. Let's get to the point." Victor set his glass down, his expression turning serious. "Of course. We both know the game here, Samuel. You're on the brink. Your investors are pulling out, your company's reputation is on the line, and you're at risk of losing everything. But I can help you navigate all of that." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "And what's in it for you?" Victor's smile returned, though this time it was colder. "You help me gain control of some of your key properties, and I'll make sure your investors stay on board. I have the connections, the influence. You won't lose your empire, Samuel, but it's going to cost you." Samuel clenched his jaw. The offer was clear. Victor wanted to take a slice of the business in exchange for saving him. The catch, of course, was that he would never truly be able to escape Victor's grasp. "No," Samuel said firmly, despite the growing panic in his chest. "I won't do that. I won't sell out." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly unamused. "You don't have a choice. If you want to salvage anything, this is your only option. And trust me, you're in no position to turn it down. We can make sure everything looks smooth the way it should. Your reputation, your future, all of it." Samuel stared at him, feeling the walls close in around him. This was the test. The pressure was building, and he had to choose, take the easy way out or find his own way through the storm. "I'll figure it out myself," Samuel said, his voice cold, though inside he was unsure. He had been pushed into a corner, but he wouldn't let Victor Reed win. Not like this. Victor's eyes flashed with something darker, something that made Samuel's skin crawl. "I'll be watching, Samuel. Don't think I'll forget this opportunity." With that, Samuel stood, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let Victor manipulate him. He couldn't. But what would he do next? How could he possibly fix this without losing everything? And more importantly, was there anyone left he could trust? As he stepped out into the chilly evening air, Samuel realized the stakes had never been higher. His next move would be critical, and time was running out. The events of the past few days had left Samuel exhausted, both physically and emotionally. His conversation with Victor had pushed him to a breaking point. There was something darkly manipulative in Victor's offer, something that Samuel couldn't ignore. But as much as Samuel had rejected the easy way out, the pressure continued to mount. Every day felt like he was getting closer to losing everything. As he stood in the sleek, cold lobby of his penthouse building, waiting for the elevator to take him up to his apartment, Samuel couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that things were slipping beyond his control. The weight of the decision he had made to cut ties with Charlotte still hung heavy on him. But that was the easy part. What came next was the real challenge. The elevator doors slid open, and Samuel stepped inside, his mind racing. But just as the doors began to close, a familiar voice called out, "Samuel!" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He turned to see Charlotte standing in the hallway, her presence commanding the space. Her usual polished exterior seemed off today, the edges of her demeanor slightly frayed. Her expression was tight, but beneath the surface he could see the strain. "Charlotte," he said, his voice guarded. "What are you doing here?" She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor, echoing in the empty space. "We need to talk," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. Samuel hesitated for a moment, the elevator doors still open. For a split second he considered walking away, avoiding this conversation entirely. But the truth had already been laid bare between them. He couldn't run anymore, not from her, not from himself. He gestured toward the apartment door. Let's go inside then. As they walked into his penthouse, the tension was palpable. Charlotte didn't wait for him to speak. She had always been direct, a trait Samuel had admired when they first met. Now, however, it felt more like a weapon. "Why didn't you tell me, Samuel?" she demanded. "You've been hiding this from me. Your company is on the brink of collapse and you didn't say a word. You let me walk around acting like everything was fine." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He had anticipated this confrontation, but it still stung. "You don't get to talk to me like that, Charlotte. I said it, but you didn't take it seriously, and you've known what was happening for months. But you were too busy focusing on yourself, on your image, to actually care about the truth." She flinched at the words, but only for a moment. Her voice softened, but it wasn't sincere. "I was worried about you, Samuel, but you didn't let me in. You shut me out. You've always shut me out. What was I supposed to do?" Samuel clenched his fists at his sides. "What were you supposed to do?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe you could have been there for me when I needed you most. Maybe you could have asked how I was feeling instead of treating this like some business deal." Charlotte's eyes flashed with something close to anger. "This isn't some petty emotional drama, Samuel. This is reality. You're about to lose everything. You're about to lose your reputation, your company, us. What do you expect me to do, sit here and let you fall apart? I have my own life, my own career to think about." Samuel shook his head, disbelief creeping in. "You were never here for me, Charlotte. You were never here for us. You were here for the lifestyle, for the status. That's all it ever was." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Charlotte's face shifted between frustration and something else. Regret, maybe, or even fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but Samuel cut her off. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I let you into my life, thinking that you cared about me for who I was, but you never did. You cared about what I could give you. And that's the truth. So don't stand there and act like I'm the one who failed this relationship. I gave you everything, Charlotte, and you gave me nothing but a front." Her expression hardened, and for a moment Samuel thought she might lash out, but she didn't. She just stood there, taking in his words, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Finally she spoke, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, her eyes not meeting his. "Maybe I've been too focused on everything else. Maybe I've been too wrapped up in my own world to see the damage I've caused. But I never thought it would come to this. I never thought you'd give up on us so easily." Samuel's heart felt like it was splitting in two. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that this was the right decision. But hearing her say those words, he realized that deep down he hadn't wanted to end things, not really. "I didn't give up on us, Charlotte. I gave up on the lie we've been living. This wasn't real," Samuel said, his voice low but resolute. "And I can't keep pretending it was." For a long moment, Charlotte just stood there, her face unreadable. And then finally, her voice broke through the silence. "Then what now, Samuel?" Her words were almost a whisper. "What do we do now?" Samuel stared at her, the weight of his decision heavy on his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally facing the truth. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew that he couldn't keep living in the shadows of lies. "I don't know what comes next," Samuel said quietly, "but I know this. I have to find out who I really am without you, without all of this. I have to rebuild, not just my business, but my life." Charlotte didn't say anything. She just nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she turned and walked toward the door. Samuel watched her go, feeling the finality of the moment sink in. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone. For the first time in a long while, Samuel didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel empty. He felt something else, hope. The quiet hum of the city outside his penthouse window had never felt so distant. As Samuel sat in his favorite chair, staring out at the skyline, it occurred to him that for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel suffocating. The truth, harsh and painful as it had been, had cracked open the door to something he couldn't yet understand, but knew was waiting for him. A new beginning. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, climbing the ladder, maintaining the image, pleasing everyone around him. But now, with the weight of his failed engagement and his business on the brink of collapse, he realized that the very things he thought would save him had only kept him imprisoned. The empire he had built was no longer his measure of success. It was something deeper, something more personal, and it was terrifying. The phone buzzed on the table, cutting through his thoughts. It was Lena, the barista from the cozy cafe. She had somehow become a lifeline in the weeks that had followed his emotional collapse. Their conversations, though brief, had a weight to them that Samuel hadn't expected. Lena didn't need anything from him. She wasn't asking for a part of his world or trying to fix him. She was simply there, offering an open ear and a kind heart. He picked up the phone and answered. "Hey, Lena." "Hey, Samuel." Her voice came through, warm and easy, as always. "I was thinking about you. How are you holding up?" Samuel let out a soft laugh. He hadn't expected her to call, but somehow her reaching out felt like the comfort he needed right now. "I'm okay," he said, though he knew it was only part of the truth. "Still figuring things out, you know? The company's still a mess and there's a lot to do. But I'm starting to see things differently." Lena paused for a moment. "I'm glad to hear that. I know things seem tough right now, but I believe you can get through it. You're a lot stronger than you give yourself credit for." Her words cut through the noise in his head. Samuel closed his eyes, allowing himself to fully absorb what she was saying. Stronger than I give myself credit for. It was a strange, almost alien thought, but it felt true. It felt like the key to whatever came next. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Samuel admitted. "You know, the whole idea of strength. I spent so many years trying to build this perfect life, but it was all a facade. Now I don't know where to start. I feel like everything I built is crumbling, and I don't even know who I am anymore." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Lena responded, her voice steady but kind. "Maybe it's time for you to let go of the idea of perfection and just figure out who you are without all the external noise. You've been running this whole time, trying to be what everyone else expects of you. Maybe now's the time to do it for you." Samuel felt something stir deep within him. The words were simple, but they were the truth he had been avoiding for far too long. Who am I without all of this? It was a question he hadn't dared ask himself. But now, as he sat in the silence of his penthouse, it felt like the only question worth answering. The conversation shifted toward lighter topics. Lena shared some of the new recipes she was experimenting with at the cafe, and Samuel laughed at her stories. It felt good, real, to laugh without the weight of his troubles hanging over him. And in that moment, he realized that this connection, though small, had brought him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The next morning, Samuel woke up with a clarity he hadn't known in years. He made his coffee just the way Lena had taught him to make it and sat by the window. The city stretched before him, still bustling, still moving, while he felt strangely still. It was as if he was standing on the edge of a new chapter in his life. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Maggie. She was checking in, as always. The two of them had been working closely since the business began to falter. She was the one who had encouraged him to make the hard choices, to face the uncomfortable truths. "Hey, Sam, just checking in. Have you had a chance to think about what's next? We need to talk about next steps." Samuel stared at the message for a long time. What was next? The easy answer was to throw himself back into the business, to try to salvage whatever was left of his company. But a deeper part of him knew that rushing back into the familiar world of deals and contracts wasn't the answer. Instead, he typed out a response. "I think it's time to change direction. I need to do something meaningful, something that aligns with who I am now. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I need a break. I need to figure this out." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then sat back in his chair. There it was, his first step forward, the decision to step away from everything he had known, to embrace the unknown. Later that day, Samuel met with Maggie at the office. She was surprised to see him in a more relaxed state. Usually he was all business, focused, driven, always pushing forward. But today, he was different. There was a calmness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're serious, aren't you?" Maggie said, reading the shift in his demeanor. You're stepping away from all of this. Samuel nodded slowly. I think it's time. I've been so focused on rebuilding my company, but I haven't focused on rebuilding myself. I need to find out who I am without this world, without the pressure. Maggie studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. I think you're making the right choice, Sam. You've always been so caught up in the game, in the rush of success. Maybe now it's time to slow down and figure out what truly matters to you. Her words were the affirmation he needed. He wasn't just walking away from his company. He was walking towards something bigger, something more meaningful. As he left the office that afternoon, Samuel felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a sense of closure, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance to find out who he was when the noise faded away. For the first time in years, he was ready to begin. Samuel sat at his desk, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow across the room. It felt like the world outside was moving on, yet Samuel remained still, paralyzed by the enormity of the decision he had made. Walking away from the empire he had built hadn't been easy, and now, as he faced the blank page, it was clear that the hardest part was still ahead. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and realizations. He had made the decision to step away from the company, to remove himself from the world he had been living in for so long. But what came next? Where did he go from here? How did he rebuild not just his business but himself? He ran his fingers through his hair, exhaling a long breath. This wasn't just about finding a new direction for his career. It was about discovering who he was without the weight of expectations and the constant need to perform. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Lena, the barista who had become his unexpected anchor in the midst of everything. Hey Samuel, how's it going? I was thinking about you. Want to grab coffee later? A small smile tugged at his lips. In a world where everything seemed uncertain, Lena's simple, genuine friendship was something he could rely on. He typed a quick response. I'd like that. I'll meet you at the cafe later. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, looking out the window once more. The Chicago skyline spread out before him, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what he had lost. It felt like a canvas, waiting for him to paint a new future. It was liberating, but terrifying. The truth was, Samuel had never really known who he was outside of his business. He had built his identity on success, on wealth, on the idea of constantly climbing higher. But now, with the business in shambles, with the relationship he had built his life around crumbled, he was left with nothing but questions. What did he want? Who was he without the suit, without the title, without the image he had worked so hard to maintain? The realization was both freeing and overwhelming. Samuel didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running from himself. He thought back to his conversation with Maggie. She had supported him through everything, never judging, always pushing him to find a way forward. The decision to step away from his company had been a difficult one, but it was a necessary one. Now it was time to move forward with purpose, to build something real, something that mattered to him. The phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was from Maggie. Sam, we need to talk. There's something important I need to discuss with you. Samuel frowned at the message. He had a feeling he knew what this was about. Maggie had always been straightforward with him, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. He quickly dialed her number, waiting as it rang. Sam, Maggie's voice came through, tense but controlled. I've been doing some digging. You're not going to like this, but we need to talk about the company's future. Samuel's heart sank. He had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. What's going on? He asked, his voice tight. It's not looking good, Sam. The board is starting to talk about selling off some of the key assets. They're pushing for a quick resolution, but honestly, I don't think it's going to save us. The reputation damage is worse than I anticipated. Samuel exhaled sharply. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when all the work he had done to salvage the business would fall apart. The weight of it settled in his chest. So, what do we do now? Maggie hesitated for a moment before responding. You need to take control of the narrative, Sam. You're the one who built this. If you want to rebuild, you need to make your mark again, on your terms. I'm willing to help you with that, but you need to decide what you want to do. Samuel's mind raced. The weight of the decision was crushing, but Maggie's words gave him clarity. This was it. This was his chance to finally stop living in the shadows of his former self and start anew. But it wouldn't be easy. It would take every ounce of courage he had left. He hung up the phone, a sense of resolve slowly creeping in. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, Samuel made his way to the cafe where Lena worked. The familiar warmth of the place was a welcome contrast to the sterile office spaces he had been surrounded by for years. Lena was behind the counter, her smile lighting up the room as she greeted him. "Hey, Samuel," she said, her voice easy. "How's it going?" He smiled back, grateful for her presence. "I'm still figuring it out, but I'm getting there." Lena poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter toward him. "Well, you know where to find me if you need someone to talk to." Samuel took the coffee gratefully and sat down at one of the small tables by the window. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but sitting here in this moment, he knew he was taking the first step. He had always thought that success meant building something grand, something impressive. But now, with everything falling apart around him, he realized that success meant something far simpler. It meant building something real, something that had meaning beyond money, beyond status, something that he could be proud of. As the day turned to evening, Samuel's mind began to take shape. He would start over. He would use what little he had left and focus on what truly mattered: community, authenticity, and building a business that contributed to something bigger than himself. He finished his coffee and stood up, leaving a tip on the table. Before he walked out the door, Lena waved. "Take care of yourself, Samuel. You've got this." Her words stayed with him as he stepped back into the streets of Chicago, the city's hum filling his ears. Samuel didn't know what the future held, but he felt something stirring inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about rebuilding a company, it was about rebuilding his life, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready to begin. Samuel had always believed that the hardest part of his journey would be the moment he walked away from his business, the empire he had worked his entire life to build. But now, standing at the crossroads of his future, he realized that was just the beginning. The true test wasn't about walking away. It was about what he did next. And what he did next would define him, for better or for worse. The decision to leave Brooks and Company had been tough, but it felt like the right one. Yet as the days turned into weeks, Samuel found himself facing an even more daunting challenge: building a new life. He had taken his first steps, but now he had to navigate the complexities of rebuilding his reputation, his identity, and his career. No one had given him a blueprint. There was no map for this kind of reinvention. The phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at it, the name on the screen sending a wave of unease through him. Arthur Brooks, his father. Samuel had been avoiding him for weeks, not out of spite, but because he knew what the conversation would entail. Arthur didn't understand his decision to step away from the business. In fact, he had been quietly urging Samuel to return and take control. The last thing Samuel wanted was another conversation with his father about obligations and duties, but avoiding it wasn't helping, and Samuel knew he had to face the music eventually. He answered the call, his voice steady. "Dad?" There was a long pause before Arthur's deep voice came through, commanding and unwavering as always. "Samuel, I trust you're doing well, but we need to talk." Samuel's grip tightened on the phone. He had expected nothing less. "What about?" "About the company. I've heard about your decision to step down. I can't say I agree with it, son. You've built something great and now you're just going to walk away?" Arthur's words were laced with disappointment, tinged with an underlying frustration. Samuel took a breath. "It's not that simple, Dad. I've realized that everything I've been doing, the way I've been living, hasn't been for me. It's been about maintaining an image, fulfilling expectations. I can't keep doing that. Arthur didn't respond immediately. There was a silence on the other end of the line, one that stretched long enough for Samuel to feel the weight of his father's judgment. When Arthur spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less firm. "You're running away, Samuel. You can't just abandon everything. You've put years of work into this. You owe it to yourself and to your legacy to see this through." Samuel clenched his jaw. "I don't want to live in the shadow of someone else's expectations anymore. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm choosing to build something that aligns with who I really am. I want to do something meaningful." Arthur's sigh echoed through the phone, heavy with years of unspoken expectations. "Meaningful. You always were sentimental, but this is business, son. This is about survival. You think you can rebuild something from nothing? You've already lost so much." Samuel's heart clenched. His father's words stung, but he refused to let them break him. "Maybe I've lost things, but I'm not losing myself, Dad. That's the difference. I'm done living for others. This is my life, and I'm choosing to take it back." Arthur was silent for a long time, and Samuel could feel the weight of that silence. Finally, his father spoke, his voice quieter, tinged with a hint of reluctant understanding. "Do what you must, Samuel, but don't expect me to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart." Samuel exhaled slowly, the finality of the conversation settling in his chest. "I won't need you to, Dad. I'm building something new, and I'll do it on my own terms." Before he could respond, Samuel ended the call, the line clicking dead in his ear. He stared at the phone for a moment, the tension slowly dissipating. It had been a long time coming, but he had finally drawn a line in the sand. His father's approval, his family's legacy. It no longer mattered. What mattered now was his own path. The next few days were a blur of meetings with potential investors, brainstorming sessions with Maggie, and countless late nights as Samuel sifted through ideas for his new venture. He was determined to create something that wasn't just a business, but a platform for change, a way to give back to the community that had always supported him. It wasn't about luxury properties or skyscrapers anymore. It was about affordable housing, sustainable development, and revitalizing neighborhoods that had been left behind. But as the pressure mounted, so did the doubts. Would people take him seriously? Would they believe in his new vision? The business world was unforgiving, and Samuel knew that stepping away from Brooks and Company had made him vulnerable. He had no guarantees this new path would lead to success. The stakes had never been higher. And then, just as he was beginning to make headway, Victor Reed resurfaced. Victor's presence had always loomed large in Samuel's life, an ever-present reminder of the ruthlessness of the business world. Samuel had rejected his offer, but Victor wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. The phone rang, and the name on the screen made Samuel's blood run cold. He answered, his voice tight. "What do you want, Victor?" "I think you know why I'm calling," Victor said, his voice smooth as ever. "I've been keeping an eye on your little rebuild, Samuel, and I have to say, I'm impressed. But let's be honest, you can't do this on your own. You need help. I'm offering you the chance to partner up, a mutual benefit. You keep your independence, but I bring the resources. What do you say?" Samuel felt the weight of Victor's words settle over him. He had known this moment would come, the temptation of easy money, the lure of power. Victor knew exactly how to play the game, but Samuel also knew that taking this deal would mean losing everything he had worked for. It would mean compromising on the very values that had led him to this point. "No," Samuel replied, his voice resolute. "I don't need your help. I'm doing this on my own." Victor's tone shifted, a thin smile audible through the phone. "You're making a mistake, Samuel. You can't fight the system forever." The call ended abruptly, and Samuel set the phone down, feeling the familiar pang of doubt in his chest. But as the silence filled the room, he realized something important. This was the final test. To reclaim his life, to rebuild from the ground up, he had to make choices like this. Hard choices. He couldn't afford to compromise now. Samuel took a deep breath, looking out the window at the city that had always been both his battleground and his inspiration. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was ready to face it on his own terms. The weight of the last few months still lingered, but for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the tension beginning to ease. The call with Victor, the lingering shadow of his past life, had been the final test, the point at which he chose his future over his past. Choosing independence over compromise had been difficult, but now it felt like the only option that truly mattered. He was no longer running from what others expected of him. He was stepping into a life that was authentically his. After he had shut down Victor's offer, Samuel spent the next few weeks in a whirlwind of planning. The small steps he had taken toward reinventing himself were beginning to take shape. He found himself increasingly focused on creating something not just for personal success, but for the community that had supported him in ways he hadn't realized before. Affordable housing, local businesses, and sustainable development. These were the things that truly moved him now. But as he poured himself into his work, something else had shifted. Lena. Their conversations had become more frequent, more meaningful. She was still the grounding force in his life, the one person who had never asked for anything from him except authenticity. Their friendship had blossomed into something more, though neither of them had fully admitted it yet. One afternoon, after yet another long day of strategizing and meetings, Samuel found himself sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop with a sense of accomplishment. His mind was tired, but satisfied. He had just completed a presentation for a group of potential investors who were excited about his new vision. Samuel had felt a mix of fear and exhilaration in pitching something so personal. But it was clear they saw the same potential he did. There was hope on the horizon, and he was starting to believe it could be real. His phone buzzed with a message from Lena. "Hey, I was thinking of you. Want to meet up for coffee?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He had come to look forward to these moments where they could just be themselves without the weight of expectations or pressures. No business talk, no complicated plans, just the simplicity of being in each other's company. He typed back quickly, "I'd love that. How about the cafe in an hour?" He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment. It was almost surreal, the way everything was coming together. The past few months had been the hardest of his life, but they had also been the most transformative. He wasn't just rebuilding a business, he was rebuilding his identity. When he arrived at the cafe, Lena was already there, sitting at a corner table with a book in hand. Her face lit up when she saw him, and for a brief moment Samuel felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just the barista from the cafe anymore. She had become someone he could rely on, someone who made him feel seen, understood, and valued. It wasn't just the connection they shared. It was the simple, effortless way she brought light into his life. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "How was your day?" "Busy," she replied with a smile. "But better now that you're here." Samuel chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. There was something about being around Lena that felt right. It wasn't about her trying to fix him or offering advice. It was just about being there in the moment without the need for anything more. They talked about everything and nothing, life, their pasts, the future. For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a sense of peace he couldn't explain. This wasn't a conversation about business or the world of high stakes. It was about what truly mattered: connection, trust, and the simple joy of being with someone who made you feel like you belonged. After a few hours of talking and laughing, they stood to leave. As they walked outside, the evening air was cool, but it felt refreshing. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, and for a moment, Samuel didn't feel overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had to rebuild. Lena stopped for a moment, turning to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Samuel, I've been thinking about everything you've been doing. You're really trying to make a difference. And I think that's amazing." Samuel looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I've had a lot of time to think about what really matters. It's not just about fixing the business, it's about creating something real, something that can change lives." She smiled, a gentle smile that reached her eyes. "I believe in what you're doing, and I believe in you. You've come so far already." He felt something stir inside him, a warmth that wasn't just from the coffee or the evening air. Thanks, Lena. It means a lot to hear that. The moment felt heavier than any words could express. Samuel had spent so long chasing success in the wrong ways, thinking that business and wealth defined who he was. But now, standing here with Lena, he realized that success was about so much more. It was about growth, authenticity, and sharing that growth with someone who truly understood you. As they parted ways, Samuel watched her walk down the street, a sense of clarity settling over him. His life was no longer about building something to impress or to maintain a facade. It was about creating a future that meant something, something that would last, something that could make a difference in the world. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps the most important part of his journey wasn't just about rebuilding his career. It was about building a life, a future together. For the first time, he felt the weight of his past lift. He wasn't just starting over, he was starting something entirely new, a future he could be proud of.